So in this session, or in this video, let's talk some about the expectations for the course, get into talking specifically about requirements and some things that you can expect from week to week. This course, as we go through the next several weeks through the rest of the semester, we'll be doing a couple of things as we move through this information about church history. First, of course, is reflected in the name. As a survey of church history, we are going to be examining church history. We'll be talking about that from the time of the apostles. We'll just briefly spend some time on the first century and move the whole way through till the very early parts of the 21st century. Now, this is an overview. This is a survey. We're not going to have the time necessarily to cover everything that we could possibly say about every specific time period in church history. So I'm going to highlight things that I think are important for you to know, or at least I think that are interesting, or things that I think are that are relevant to an overarching narrative about what church history is about. That doesn't mean that the things that I don't cover, specific movements or individuals or developments, that doesn't mean that they're not important. It's just I as the instructor have kind of made some decisions based on my particular interests or my particular inclinations, and so I would say there's a lot more out there for you to investigate. If there's something that interests you, that would be something I would encourage you to look into. And if you're not sure where to start, by all means, feel free to get in contact with me about that, and we'll see if we can together find some good resources for you to explore maybe a particular issue. That being said, we're going to be examining a couple of different things. We're going to be looking at specific individuals and movements. We're going to be looking at as the different types of Christianity develop. We'll be talking about most of them. We're certainly going to be talking about beliefs. What have Christians believed at various times? What kind of creeds or confessions or specific doctrines did they hold on to, develop? But we'll also be talking about practices and thinking about what is it the Christians did. The Christianity is not just about beliefs, although there are some very important beliefs that we as Christians espouse, that we hold on to, that are the central part of what it means to be Christian. But a lot of what we do as Christians is also important too. What kind of practices do we engage in, and how do those practices connect with those beliefs, maybe reinforce or challenge those beliefs? So we're going to be looking broadly here, and not just at specific doctrines. We're going to be talking about people and try to get into a very broad examination of church history. And not necessarily from the standpoint of dates, right? This happened, but try to have a well-rounded approach to the history. But with that also, there is a call here, sometimes more explicit, sometimes less explicit, about what does this tell us, or what does this show us about contemporary Christianity, and thinking about how certain things have evolved, right, as movements have developed, as Christianity itself moved from the first century to now the 21st century, and so it's not just about learning people and beliefs and practices just to have that information, as much as it is also a call to think about how is it that my specific group or my specific congregation does certain things that are shaped by some of the things that have taken place before. So I wanted to not just be a looking back to the past, but also thinking about the present and even thinking about the future as well. How have we gotten to where we are? Where are we going from here? There are two textbooks in this course, both of those written by Justo Gonzalez, a historian, historical theologian. He's written several different books on the history of Christianity, history of Christian thought. There are a variety of things he's written, but these two books, The Story of Christianity, volumes 1 and volume 2, are very accessible, very readable. They are, as you can see, published by Harper One. Harper One is a more general publisher, popular level publisher. They are certainly academic. Professor Gonzalez has put a lot of work into all the work that he's done with writing this, but he writes on a very accessible level. So hopefully it'll be pretty, not easy, but it'll be something that you can get into and really have an easy time following what he's saying. And so those textbooks are very important. Certainly we'll be using volume 1 much earlier than volume 2. And so I would encourage you to get the textbooks as soon as you can. But I also recognize that sometimes finances are an issue, and so volume 1 you want to get more quickly than volume 2, and so volume 2 will need probably more towards the middle of the course. I'll say more about how the textbooks are used here in a little bit. For the scope of this course, as we go throughout the next 16 weeks, we are pretty much going to follow a chronological outline. We're going to start at the beginning, move our way through, and end, Lord willing, in the contemporary period toward the end of the class. As we go throughout this period, this semester, the first couple of weeks, we will go by centuries. And so we'll look at the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century. As also, I forgot to mention, we'll talk about some of the backgrounds to Christianity. They'll talk about some things even before the 1st century and talk about, what was the situation like prior to Christianity developing. And then we'll follow kind of a century format. When we get to the Middle Ages, however, we'll be looking at some bigger blocks of time instead of going every century. So we'll look at like the early Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages, like the end of the Middle Ages, this kind of transformation time between the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Reformation. So in the middle part, we're not going to be going as much by centuries. As we get toward the end, after the Reformation, we'll pick up and go the century route again. Largely, that is due to trying to get 2,000 years of Christianity into a 16-week course. And so, it's not as specific in the Middle Ages as it is on either end. But for the most part, following a chronological outline. And within that, I want to talk a little bit more about how we're going to organize looking at each of those periods with that. And as we look at each of those periods, we're going to divide it up into 4, sometimes 5 categories that we'll look at across a specific time period. Again, there's all sorts of ways that we could do this. But this is kind of a way that I want us to see not only the impact, or not only the development of Christianity itself, but also thinking about how Christianity is influenced by the culture around it, as well as how Christianity is influencing the culture. So I want to kind of do this categorical type of approach to situate Christianity in a broader cultural context. Now, that means we're going to be slightly different than the way Gonzalez is presenting it in his text. So the lectures will overlap the books in a lot of ways. We're going to talk about the same kind of things, but how the material is organized is going to be different. And there are going to be some things that we discuss in the lectures that Gonzalez doesn't talk about. There will be some things that Gonzalez talks about that we don't discuss in the lectures. So just to kind of, give you an idea of there's going to be some differences. And so these two, the lectures and the textbooks kind of work together to give you a larger picture. But let's talk about the organizations of the lecture. One area, and the area that we'll focus on first in each period, is politics. As we'll see throughout the historical development of Christianity, the interaction of religion and politics has taken a variety of different forms. As Christians are spreading the message of Jesus in the early centuries, they are doing so outside any sort of political influence, any sort of a substantial political influence. But beginning in the 4th century, Christianity becomes a very central part of the politics of the Roman Empire. And so that will be a big transition. And of course, there's a lot of transitions that take place throughout the Middle Ages. And then post-Reformation, as you get into the more modern times, there's another set of switches, another set of changes that takes place. And so the interaction between Christianity and politics, I think, is an important one for us. Yes, some of that is driven, of course, by some of the things we see in our contemporary society, but I also think it's a very important development that even outside of the ways that things have developed in the United States in the past 4 decades, that there would still be a need for us to explore Christianity and politics more. The second category we'll be looking at as we go through the different time periods is culture and society. Now, the way I'm conceptualizing this is slightly different than politics. So it's not as much driven by politics, although there's sometimes some overlap. But basically, we'll be looking at, in this component of each of these periods, is thinking about how did Christians view the world around them, the culture around them. Right? Is culture something that should be avoided? Is culture something that should be embraced? How did Christians think about different cultural issues? How did they live out their lives in culture? How did they engage in culture production? So, as we get toward more modern times, thinking about Christian influence on literature and art and music, we'll certainly talk about that at various places prior to the modern period, but definitely, want to think about that as we get towards the Renaissance and the Reformation, the early modern period. A third category we'll look at is doctrine. In many cases, the history of Christianity and its doctrine or theology is one of continuity and change. There are things that we as Christians believe today that are very similar, if not exactly similar, to what first century Christians believed. There are other things, however, where what we believe today is different. Sometimes that I don't necessarily mean different in the sense of oppositional. We believe something that they would have been opposed to. But our doctrines, teachings, theologies have been shaped by 2,000 years of development. And as Christians have encountered new situations, as Christians have attempted to respond to their culture and society, to their politics, they have changed and shaped Christian doctrine, or they've emphasized certain doctrines more than those doctrines had been emphasized by previous generations. And so we'll talk about doctrine more focused on development and change rather than continuity. So we won't necessarily spend a lot of time saying, oh, by the way, Christians in this particular period also still believed that X, Y, Z. We'll be focusing more on, how did Christians respond doctrinally to this event? Here are some new doctrines that were developed. Here are some new takes on old doctrines. So we'll be focusing more on change rather than continuity. The fourth category we'll talk about is practices. Here too, continuity and change. There are some practices that are done today that were done back then. There are some things that are new today than were done back then. There are practices that have taken different shapes so that, for example, let's say something like communion or the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or the Mass or whatever name we use, right? That in itself suggests change. So first century Christians practiced a ritual meal involving bread and wine, remembering the death and resurrection of Jesus. That is still done today in contemporary Christianity, using Christianity there very broadly as an umbrella term for all different sorts of types. But as we think about the different ways that different groups, religious traditions approach communion, it's quite different as far as what they think about what's taking place, with some people believing that Jesus is sometimes physically or sometimes only spiritually present in the bread and the wine or grape juice. And so there's that difference. Others saying, no, it's more a memorial remembrance of Jesus, not necessarily connecting Jesus's presence with the particular elements of the meal. There's variation as to when and how often people participate in this practice. So here too, we'll be looking at changes, developments more than continuity. And so any sort of continuity we'll be talking about in the context of how did this change. So those are the four major ones we'll talk about most of the time. Every so often, we'll talk about a fifth category, and that would be geographic spread. There are more periods, well, there are some periods where there's more development of Christianity spreading into new places. And so sometimes we'll highlight more often than others how Christianity is moving into new places, how it is evangelizing new peoples, or it is taking new approaches to evangelism. And so sometimes we'll talk about geographic spread, but not always. Those first four, politics, culture, doctrine, and practice, we will talk about for each time period, but there will be other time periods where we'll also talk about geographic spread. So if that is kind of the roadmap of the course, where we're going and how we're going to get there, there are a couple of things that hopefully by the end of this course you'll be able to do. Several of these, of course, we've already kind of touched on as we talked about the overview of the course. And so the ideal is that by the end of this course, you'll be able to talk about people, events, certain texts, different things like that that have taken place in church history. So that when somebody talks about Jonathan Edwards, or somebody talks about Tertullian, or somebody talks about Pope Innocent III, you'll know who they're talking about. You'll be able to say, oh, I know who Jonathan Edwards is. He's a preacher from the 18th century who was involved in revivalism. And so, one thing that's very important is, knowing some of those key things, people, places, events, not as many dates, just a few dates there, because it's important to have those ideas and people understood so you can do some of these other things in this class. For example, we'll also talk about the development of Christianity with respect to politics and those categories we just talked about. So you can say, here's how Christianity developed with respect to political ideas. So having those components, having that, knowing who the people are, knowing who the events are, that will help better say, okay, this is what happened with politics, this is what happened with doctrine, and be able to talk and analyze different claims people make about the history of Christianity. When they say things like, well, America was founded as a Christian nation. I mean, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. There'll be some discussion about that, but you'll be able to say, okay, what's that person trying to say about Christianity, about its history, when they say something like America is a Christian nation. You'll also be able to, ideally, discuss the influence of history, philosophy, politics, culture on Christianity, as well as the reverse, the impact Christianity has had on history, philosophy, politics, etc. And so, we'll want to be thinking about, how does Christianity shape those things? How is it shaped by those things? And then also, finally, some critical thinking and writing skills. Now, it would be nice if at the end of the semester I could just ask you and say, can you do these things, right? These 6 things. And you say yes, and I say, great, here is an A for the course. Doesn't work like that. So I'm going to need to have you do some things that demonstrate your abilities at these various things. And so the way that these things are going to be assessed is through a couple of different exercises, a couple of different assignments that will say more about each of these things here in a minute. There'll be reading quizzes. There'll be reading quizzes nearly every week of the semester. There'll be some reflective essays, and then there will be some exams, 2 kind of unit exams, and then a final. So let's talk about each of these a little bit more in depth. So the first of these is the reading quizzes. The reading quizzes are online on Blackboard under quizzes, quizzes and exams. There are 4, each quiz is 4 multiple choice questions based on the reading. So from the Gonzalez textbooks. You will have 10 minutes to take the quiz. If you've done the reading and are prepared for it, it should not be a problem. 10 minutes should be plenty. I will drop the lowest score. Usually, if you have missed a quiz, I will not give you the chance for a makeup. If there is a unique situation, feel free to get in contact with me. But since they are open for the entire week, you have a lot of time each week to complete it. In most cases, there are 2 reading quizzes each week, kind of broken down the quiz into kind of like 2 reading sections. And so most cases there are 2 sets of reading quizzes, or 2 reading quizzes, I should say. If there's an exam that week, there's usually only 1 reading quiz. Let me show you some things here. Well, before we get that, I want to talk about how do you know what to look for? How do you know what kind of things I should really focus on as I'm reading? On Blackboard, I have put a key things to know page. Use that as a guide to reading. That will help you focus on specific things in each of the chapters from Gonzalez, and I will draw questions from those specific things. And so, pay attention to that key things to know page. Let me show you where that is. So we'll share. So on Blackboard, and let me get out of this. When you enter Blackboard, it should look something like this. Down here on the left is the key things to know. And when you look at the key things to know, it's broken down by quiz. All right, it tells you what chapters you need to know for that particular quiz, as well as what terms you need to know. So pay attention to this as you're reading. Maybe highlight certain things as you're going through. We're looking for very, very basic understanding. So the key things to know, Volume 1 of Gonzalez, all right, Quiz 1, Quiz 2, Quiz 3. These are in the order of how you come across them in Gonzalez. And so if you are looking for, let's say you're preparing for Quiz 3, you're looking for the Didache, but you didn't find it and you've gotten to the Shepherd of Hermas, you've missed it, right? Go back. For this, I'm just looking for some very basic ideas. So what the Didache was, right? Just a description of what the Didache is. That's kind of what we're looking at. If you have any questions or ever have a problem trying to find something, feel free to reach out to me by email, and I'd be glad to help you find what you're looking for. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So the reading quizzes, as I mentioned, 4 multiple choice questions. You'll have 10 minutes each week to that. The key things to know page will also help you prepare for exams. If you do not have your textbooks yet, and it's going to be a little bit before you have your textbook, please let me know so that I can make sure that you have the opportunity to take those reading quizzes. So please let me know that as soon as possible if you do not have, especially Volume 1. And like I said, Volume 1 you need to get as soon as possible. The second assessment is a variety of 5 reflective essays. We won't be doing a research paper in this class. Instead, we'll be doing some smaller reflective essays throughout the semester. They will be based off of primary sources, things that individual Christians have written at various times through the history of Christianity. Tried to keep them relatively small, right? It's not just a line or two, right? So there's several paragraphs, some of them a little bit more substantial in length than others. Some of them a little bit more difficult to get through than others. So some of them you might need to spend some time with. Say, okay, what's this guy talking about? What's this person talking about? They are listed on Blackboard under assignments. All 5 of them are there, along with the link. All the readings are for this section are available online. There will be 5 essays that you will need to complete throughout the semester. Essentially, half of your essay should be a summary of what you've read, And the other half should be an analysis. What does this tell us about Christianity? And so here's what this person said. What does that tell us about Christianity? There is an example reflection essay under assignments. It's not on one of the readings, it's not on one of the sections of one of the readings we've done, or we will do, but it is basically what I'm looking for. So take a look at that sample, and if you have any questions about, all right, what do I need to write? And the first part should be summary. The second part should be analysis. Look at the example. If you're uncertain after looking at the example, feel free to get in contact with me. I'd be glad to talk with you about it. If you want to talk about the you have some ideas you want to share with me, a rough draft you want to share with me, feel free to get in contact with me about that.